Building on the insights of his best-selling book, 52 Weeks with Jesus, Dr. James Merritt has written a brand new devotional to bring renewal to all who want more of Jesus. A great companion devotional, or perfect on its own. Spend time with the one who changed everything. Get your copy of 52 Weeks with Jesus devotional from Touching Lives for $13, or get both books for just $20. Call 800-413-1131 or go to touchinglives.org.
Today on Touching Lives.
It would be a terrible thing to go through this life and never have a storm. You say, well, why is that true? Do you know why God allows us to walk into a storm? Do you know why sometimes God sends us into a storm? Do you know why sometimes God tells us to get into a storm? Because it forces us to remember His promise. And it forces us to rest in His presence. And it forces us to rely on His power.
Teaching people everywhere who Jesus is and why they need Him. This is Touching Lives with James Merritt.
If you're a guest of ours this morning, this month, we've been in a series of messages we called Supernatural. And we've been taking a look at some of the miracles that Jesus performed. And I've told you, for the last several weeks that both in quantity, how many that He did, and quality, the kind that He did, nobody in the history of the world before or since ever performed the miracles that Jesus performed. When you read the Old Testament, relatively speaking, there are not a lot of miracles there. Then Jesus comes on the scene and miracles just explode. They just happen everywhere. He probably did more miracles in one day than you'll read in the entire Old Testament. And no miracle He ever performed, in my opinion, may be more helpful or more meaningful to many of us in this room, or those who will be watching by television or the internet, or those who may be listening by the radio or whatever. There may not be a miracle that He did that will be more meaningful and more relevant to where you are than this miracle that He did some 2,000 years ago. So if you brought a copy of God's Word, I want you to turn to the second gospel. There are four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I want you to turn to Mark chapter 4. Now, I want you to remember that we are characters in every parable that Jesus taught, and we're characters in every miracle that Jesus performed. You're going to see that here. The boat is our life. The disciples are us. And the sea is the storms of life. What do you do when you're taken by storm? Number one, you remember the promise of Jesus. Just remember the promise of Jesus. Now, the way this story begins is really kind of simple, but if you don't realize this and you read it, you wouldn't understand that the way the story turns out really is the key to the entire miracle, and you can't understand it till you get down what happened. Mark 4, verse 35. On that day when evening had come, now the sun's setting, it's about to get dark. On that day when evening had come, He said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And that sounds simple enough, right? Jesus says, okay, let's get in the boat. Let's cross over to the other side. Now, did you hear what Jesus said to them? You said, yeah, I heard what He said. He said, let's go to the other side of the lake. That's not just a statement. That was a promise. That was a prediction. He said, let's get into the boat. He didn't say, let's try to make it. Let's hope we make it. Let's set sail and see what happens. He said, let's cross over to the other side. Now, Jesus never tells us to do something that He doesn't give us the power to do. And at the exact moment, if those disciples had understood what was happening, at the exact moment that Jesus said, let's cross over to the other side, there was absolutely no way that boat was not going to make it to the other side. How do I know that? Jesus never prophesied anything that didn't come true. Jesus never ever made a promise that He couldn't keep. And the moment that Jesus said, let's cross over to the other side, that boat became unsinkable. Let me tell you something. At that moment, the U.S. Navy could not have sunk that boat. The Roman Empire, with all of its power, could not have brought that boat down. You say, well, how do you know that? Real simple. If that boat had not made it to the other side, Jesus would have been a liar. Because He said, we're going to cross over to the other side. And so if the boat had not made it, He'd been a liar. Well, I got news for you. The sun may quit shining, the moon may quit glowing, the stars may quit twinkling, the wind may quit blowing, the waves may quit crashing. All of that may happen. Jesus will never tell a lie. If Jesus says something's going to happen, it's going to happen. So there's no way they could drown. You say, how do you know they couldn't drown? Because Jesus was in the boat. He couldn't drown. You say, wait a minute. I thought Jesus was human. He was. I thought Jesus was a man. Well, men can drown. Yeah, but how do you know that Jesus couldn't drown? Real simple. Because God wasn't through with him yet. He had not yet gone to the cross. He had not yet been nailed to the cross. He had not yet shed his blood. He had not yet died for the sins of the world. He had not yet been raised from the dead. He had not yet accomplished the work of salvation. God was not finished with him yet. And let me tell you, I've got some good news for every one of you in this room. What was true of Jesus is true of you. And there's something I know about every one of you in this room. You ready for this? This will bless you. You can't die until God is done with you. Impossible. Impossible. I mean, that's why you can take great comfort. Listen, if I die today, God forbid, if I die today, you can know one thing: God was done. God was finished. But until God's finished, nothing can happen. You are absolutely invincible. And the moment that Jesus made that promise to those disciples, you know what they should have done? They should have gone to sleep. Never in eternity past has God ever broken a promise. Never in eternity future will God ever make a promise. So if you're here this morning and you're in the middle of a storm, good news for you. You remember the promise of Jesus. Here's what Jesus has said to every one of us in this room. Okay, you're in a storm. Listen, we will make it to the other side. All right? Number 2, you rest in the presence of Jesus. Remember the promise of Jesus and rest in the presence of Jesus. Now, every detail in this miracle, you're going to see this in a moment, is very important, because listen to what we read in verse 36. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Now, I want you to listen to this next little part, because it doesn't seem like it's a big deal. And other boats were with him. Now, if you read Matthew's account of the story, he doesn't tell us that. And if you read Luke's account of the story, he doesn't tell us that. Mark, though, said, you know, there's something I just want my readers to know. Other boats were with him. In other words, Mark wanted us to know that was not the only boat on the Sea of Galilee that night. There were a lot of boats on that sea. Now, I want to ask you a question. Why does that matter? Why does Mark want us to know that there were other boats in the water? Because if we had not been told that, that would not have changed the miracle. It wouldn't have changed the story. But Mark says, no, this is very important. I want you to know that there were other boats in the water that night. Now, why do you think Mark put that detail in there? Well, let me ask you one question. So what was the difference in that boat and every other boat on the water? Somebody tell me. Jesus was in that boat. Big difference. Mark said, hey, there were a lot of boats on that lake, but we got Jesus. Jesus was in our boat, right? Now, watch this. One of the benefits you get when you become a follower of Jesus is he gets into the boat of your life. And he gets into the boat and he says, I'll never leave your boat. Now, we may go through some rough seas. We may go through some choppy waters. We may go through some big storms. But listen, I will always be in the boat with you. So he's in the boat. But then something happened that none of those disciples expected would happen. Verse 37. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. Matthew uses a totally different word than Mark did. Here's the way Matthew put it in Matthew 8. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great storm. Totally different word I'll tell you about in a minute. There arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. Now, I want to tell you why we need to listen to Matthew and the way Matthew described it, okay? Mark was not in the boat that day. He's writing what Peter told him had happened. Luke wasn't in the boat that day. He found out through his research what happened. Matthew was in the boat that day. He's an eyewitness to what happened. And Matthew said it wasn't just a windstorm that came up, it was a great storm. And the Greek word there is the word seismos. Some of you may hear a word there. A seismologist is someone who studies earthquakes, okay? In other words, a seismograph measures earthquakes. So in other words, this was not just a big bad thunderstorm. Evidently what had happened, there was kind of an earthquake. And literally the sea was erupting beneath that boat, and it was probably being tossed very high up into the water. And the waves are coming down into that boat. In other words, this was a storm that could have torn that boat apart like it was a toothpick. These are experienced fishermen. This is not like they had not been through a storm before. I mean, they've been through many storms. The reason why they were so afraid was they thought, we've never been through a storm like this. We may not make it through this storm. This is a storm that may take our lives. Now, at this point, most people fail to ask a very important question, which is another key to the story. Why did they choose to sail across that sea when it was getting dark? Why were they out there in the middle of the lake to begin with? We were just told. It wasn't their idea. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that when Jesus said, hey, let's get into the boat and cross to the other side, I'm going to give Peter credit. You know, Peter most of the time was shooting his mouth off and getting it wrong, right? Most of the time, Peter spent most of his time as a disciple pulling his foot out of his mouth. That's what he was doing. But this time, he just kept his mouth shut. But I guarantee I know what Peter wanted to say. Lord, with all due respect, we don't want to go now. It's about to get dark. Let's just spend the night. Let's go when it's broad daylight. But Jesus said, no, we're going to go right now. In other words, it wasn't their idea to be out there in the middle of that lake when that storm came up. It was his idea. Now, what am I saying? See, there are a lot of times in our life that storms will come into our life, and here's what we start thinking. Okay, now, I must have really ticked you off. I somehow have gotten out of your will for my life. Evidently, I've done something wrong, and you're really ticked off at me. I mean, we think that way. You know, how many times have you had something bad happen, and you go, you know, I knew you remembered when I took that cookie out of that cookie jar when I was 5 years old. I knew you remembered that. And here we are 30 years later. Now you're taking that on me. I mean, now you're kind of getting your pound of flesh. Listen, this will be worth coming to church for this morning. These disciples were not in the storm because they disobeyed God, but because they obeyed God. It's not because they were out of the will of God they were having a tough time. It was because they were in the will of God they were having a tough time. It's not because they had said no to God that they were in the storm. It's because they had said yes to God. It's not because they had missed God. It's because they had found God. So don't get the idea. There's some people, this is why some people check out on the church. They get this idea, if I give my life to Jesus and I love Jesus and I walk with Jesus and I read my Bible and I pay my taxes and I'm good to my wife and I don't kick my dog, God will be good to me and I'll never get in a storm. When the truth of the matter is, you may be in a storm right now, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've done something right. You may be in the middle of a storm because you just tried to do the right thing, and God knew that. I love this story. I read years ago about a man in Ohio, and he owned this oil well. And it was his only source of income. Well, the oil well caught fire. And this man is watching his livelihood just burn up right in front of his eyes. And so he puts out an all-points bulletin for help, sent it out to all the surrounding cities. He offered a $100,000 reward to whoever could put out that fire. Well, all the large firehouses from all the cities around came to help. And they sent their best companies, and they sent their best equipment, and sent their best men, and so forth. But none of those trucks could get within 200 feet, 200 yards of that blaze because it was so big, the heat was so intense, they just could not put this fire out. Well, there was a volunteer fire department in a little town called Calcutta, and they had heard about this reward, and they said, you know, the chief of the fire department said, man, we could use that money. You know, we've got this little rickety, fire truck. We need a new fire truck. We need new equipment. We need new uniforms. We've got this one little rickety truck. It's only got one ladder. It's only got 2 buckets of water, 3 buckets of sand. It's got a few buckets. The fire truck was so old it didn't even have a hose. And so the chief of the fire department said, hey, let's go out there. Maybe we can put it out. Maybe we can get this $100,000. So when that old truck came barreling down the way there to go to that oil well, they passed the point where all the other fire trucks had stopped because the heat was so great they just couldn't get close to it. They just kept right on going. They just barreled right ahead. And they went right up and finally ground to a halt right next to that oil well. It was unbelievable. They could not believe what happened. These guys got out with 2 buckets of water, 3 buckets of sand, and those blankets, beat that fire out with their bare hands and saved that oil well. Well, this guy that owned the oil well was so pumped and so excited, so overtaken with emotion, he ran up to the chief of the fire department. He said, I'm not giving you $100,000. I'm going to give you $200,000. Wrote out a check right there on the spot. He gave him the check. And he said, man, I just got to ask you, what are you going to do with all of this money? And this fire chief shaking like a leaf. And he said, the first thing I'm going to do is get the brakes fixed on this truck. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Now, see, sometimes we're in the middle of a storm. We just couldn't get the thing stopped. The brakes didn't work. We wound up doing the right thing. We weren't even trying to do it. We get thrown into the fire for trying. And then Mark adds another detail in this story that Matthew and Luke out, but I love this part. Listen to verse 38. But he, that is Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Now, this is the part of the story I love. If you get to go to Israel, when you cross the sea, about 3 years ago, they actually found a fishing boat in the Sea of Galilee. It had been buried for 2,000 years. They were able to pull it up and restore it. You can see it. And it's exactly the same size and shape of the fishing boat that Jesus would have been in 2,000 years ago. And when you look at that boat, there's only one place in the boat that's big enough to protect you and big enough and gives you enough room to sleep, and that's in the stern of that boat. And then Mark tells us that not only did he get into the stern and go to sleep, it said he took a cushion with him. The word cushion means pillow. So in other words, here's what happened. Jesus tells these disciples, okay, let's all get into the boat. We're going to take a nighttime ride across the Sea of Galilee. And they get into the boat. Immediately, he goes straight to bed. He just goes down the stern. He just falls fast asleep. He didn't fall asleep. This was a premeditated nap. Now, why was Jesus at peace when all the disciples were going to pieces? Because he remembered something that they had completely forgotten. The reason why Jesus was at perfect peace and could sleep in the middle of this storm was because he knew he was right where God wanted him to be. He said, why should I worry? Why should I fret? Why should I fear? I am in the center of God's will for my life. I am doing what God wants me to do. And if those disciples had really understood what was going on, they would have realized there's no need to fear when Jesus is near. And here's the point I want you to understand. Every time you go through a storm, you're going to think this. We all do. You're going to go through a storm and you're going to say, God, where are you? I don't feel your presence. I don't hear your voice. I don't see your face. And what God is saying to you is, I'm in the stern. I'm asleep. I'm chilling because I got everything under control. I know the storm's going on. You don't have to wake me and tell me. Has it ever occurred to you that nothing's ever occurred to God? I mean, God never goes, really? And God says, look, I'm right there. And listen, this is going to sound real strange to you. You ready for this? Here's what those disciples didn't understand. Those disciples thought, we're in danger. No, you're not. You're not only not in danger, you are in the safest place in the world you could be right now. As a matter of fact, you're safer in the boat, in the storm, than you would be in the shore outside the storm. Why is that? Because it's the will of God that you be in the boat. And I'm telling you, the safest place in this world to be is in the center of God's will for your life. And they didn't get that. They didn't understand. That's why they had to get it. Listen, I'm going to say something and you're not going to believe it. You're not. But I'm telling you it's true. Safety is not the absence of problems. Safety is the presence of Jesus. That's where safety is. Just get me to where Jesus is. I am safe. Now, we come to the climactic part of this story, which to me is the best part. And it gives us kind of the last thing to do. When you're taken by storm, you remember the promise of Jesus, you rest in the presence of Jesus, and you rely on the power of Jesus. Now look what we read in verse 39. And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind, and said, this is important, he said to he didn't scream, he didn't yell, he didn't get mad, he said to the sea, peace be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And you know, when you get into those words and you really get to the meaning, it really is cool, because the word rebuke literally means to sit down. And the word peace be still means to muzzle or to silence. So you know what? Can I tell you what Jesus really said when he got up? He probably was a little bit irritated because he wanted to take a nap. So he got up and he got to the boat, and here's what he said. Sit down and shut up. That's what he said. That's the words. Sit down. Waves said, yes, sir. Sat down. Said to the waves, shut up. Calm as glass. That's Teresa has that effect on me. Now, here's the thing I want you to notice. You notice that Jesus did not keep the storm from striking the boat. He kept the storm from sinking the boat. When Jesus gets into the boat of your life, let me tell you what he does. He doesn't guarantee you a smooth sail. He just guarantees you a safe landing. And that's where we miss it. Listen, you read the life of Jesus. He didn't have smooth sailing. But boy, did he have a safe landing. And when he gets into the boat of your life, he says to you and he says to me, he says, James, it's going to get rocky. The wind's going to really howl. The thunder's going to split your eardrums. The rain is going to fall so hard it's going to knock you flat on your back. That's okay. We will get to the other side. And I will take care of the storm. You notice what it says, by the way, in chapter 5, verse 1. Don't miss this. They came to the other side of the sea, parenthesis, just like Jesus said they would. They came to the other side of the sea. Now, what's the lesson of the miracle? We're going to wrap this up. What's the lesson of the miracle? Okay, listen, there's two lessons. There's a lesson about fear, and there's a lesson about faith, and we're going to wrap this up. See, Jesus asked the disciples a question then that he's asking some of you this morning, because you're sitting there and you're going through a trial, you're going through a storm, and you've been questioning God and doubting God and wondering where God is in your life and why did God let this happen and why doesn't God do something? And Jesus is asking you now what he asked them then, verse 40. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Now watch this. There are two lessons here. There's a lesson about fear and there's a lesson about faith. Every time we face a storm in our life, this is true of everybody in this room, me and you, everybody included. Every time we face a storm in this life, you will face it in one of two ways. There's only two ways you can face a storm, only two. You can face it with fear or you can face it with faith. And you will face it every time one of those two ways. You say, well, what's the difference? Well, it's real simple, but it's real strong. Fear looks at the storm. Faith looks at the Savior. Fear looks at the note on the counter. Faith looks to Jesus. Fear looks at the diagnosis of the doctor. Faith looks at Jesus. Fear looks at the pink slip. Faith looks at Jesus. And every time you get into a storm, you will face it with fear or face it with faith. And see, this is what I think really bothered Jesus. The reason why Jesus asked them, do you not have any faith? Why are you so afraid? The reason why it bothered Jesus is they had already seen Jesus perform miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. If you go back to Mark chapter 1, do you know how many miracles they'd already seen Jesus perform? If you go back to Mark chapter 1 all the way up through Mark 4, let me tell you what they'd already seen Jesus do. They'd already seen Jesus cast out an unclean spirit, heal Peter's mother-in-law of a fever, heal an entire city of disease, cast out demons, cleanse a leper, give a paralytic the ability to walk, restore a withered hand to complete health. He'd already proven to them over and over and over. Guys, it doesn't matter what you're facing. Disease, death, disaster, danger, I got it under control. And what Jesus was saying was, how many times do I have to do these things before you finally get it and understand it? I can handle it. And what really irritated Jesus was when they got into that boat, he had more faith in their ability to steer the ship than they did in him to still the storm. And he said, when are you ever going to understand it? There's this lesson about fear, and then there's this lesson about faith. And I've told you this many times. I've got this in my spiritual journal. I have this at the top of my daily prayer page. Every time you go through a storm, every single time, doesn't matter what it is, why it comes, how bad it is, every single time, just remember, Jesus is asking you a question. Why are you so afraid? Where is your faith? Do you trust me or not? I just want to know that one question. Do you trust me or not? Now, I'm going to say something you're not going to like, and I don't like it either, and I wish I didn't have to say it, but I'm just going to be honest with you because it's true. we need storms. It would be a terrible thing to go through this life and never have a storm. You say, well, why is that true? Do you know why God allows us to walk into a storm? Do you know why sometimes God sends us into a storm? Do you know why sometimes God tells us to get into a storm? Because it forces us to remember His promise. And it forces us to rest in His presence. And it forces us to rely on His power. He is still in the storm-stilling business. He is still in the faith-growing business. So if you're in the middle of this storm right now, or you're about to go into a storm, or you're just coming out of one, I'll just tell you this, because it works every time. You just remember the promise of Jesus. We'll get to the other side. You rest in the presence of Jesus. Whether you can see me, hear me, or feel me or not, I'm in the boat. And you rely on the power of Jesus. There's not a storm I've met that I can't handle. Because I'm telling you, there's no need to fear when Jesus is near.
Sometimes when a storm comes, there are lots of people around for support. But sometimes the storm isn't so public and no one even knows what's going on the inside. If that's you today and you're facing a problem alone, call Touching Lives at 800-413-1131. Let us pray with you and ask Jesus for the solution.
Building on the insights of his best-selling book, 52 Weeks with Jesus, Dr. James Merritt has written a brand new devotional to bring renewal to all who want more of Jesus. A great companion devotional, or perfect on its own. Spend time with the one who changed everything. Get your copy of 52 Weeks with Jesus devotional from Touching Lives for $13, or get both books for just $20. Call 800-413-1131 or go to touchinglives.org.
When bad things happen, people need to know they can trust in Jesus. But if they've never heard His message of hope, where will they turn? Because of the generosity of people like you, the ministry of Touching Lives continues to broadcast the good news of Christ through every available outlet. Together, we are taking His love to those who need it most.